Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: behind Hamas's bloody gambit to create a permanent state of war. A brief history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict explained. The deadly missile race in the Middle East. Arabs see US as complicit in Israel's Gaza war. Former Jordan envoy Washer. Wednesday briefing. Behind Hamas's bloody gambit to create a permanent state of war. New York Times. Hamas leaders have praised the group's recent attack on Israel, expressing hope that it will lead to a sustained conflict and end any coexistence between Israel, Gaza, and the surrounding countries. The attack was planned and executed by a small group of commanders in Gaza who did not share the details with their own political representatives or regional allies, leaving people outside Gaza surprised by the scale and reach of the assault. The attack broke a long-standing tension within Hamas about whether the group's identity and purpose should focus on governing Gaza or continue to be an armed force committed to destroying Israel. The assault was so devastating that it achieved one of the plotters' main objectives, breaking the tension within Hamas and doubling down on military confrontation. The attack happened because Hamas leaders believed that the Palestinian cause was being pushed aside, and only drastic action could revive it. A brief history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict explained. The Independent. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a long history that dates back to the 19th century and involves complex political, religious, and territorial issues. The conflict can be traced back to the 1799 proposal by Napoleon Bonaparte to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which was later revived by the British in 1840. The Zionist movement, which sought to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, gained momentum in the late 19th century, leading to the First Zionist Congress in 1897. The British government's Balfour Declaration in 1917 expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which was met with opposition from the Palestinian Arab population. The UN Partition Plan in 1947 proposed the creation of two states, one Jewish and one Arab, but was rejected by the Palestinians, leading to the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. The conflict has continued to escalate over the years, with the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967 and subsequent uprisings and wars. Attempts at peace, such as the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, have been met with limited success. The situation has been further complicated by factors such as the rise of extremist groups like Hamas and the election of Donald Trump as U.S. president, who took controversial actions such as recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The current escalation of violence began with protests and clashes in Jerusalem over the eviction of Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and Israeli security forces' response to worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. This led to an exchange of rocket fire between Israel and Hamas, resulting in numerous casualties and widespread destruction. The situation remains tense, with both sides vowing to continue their attacks. The deadly missile race in the Middle East. Economist. The proliferation of missiles with increasing range and precision is changing the military landscape in the Middle East, according to The Economist. The report highlights how the threat from missiles in the region is growing as more people have access to better quality missiles. The article notes that 11 countries in the Middle East now possess ballistic missiles or cruise missiles with ranges of over 250 kilometers. The report also highlights how non-state actors such as Hamas and Hezbollah now pose a military threat that only states could have posed 20 years ago. The report concludes by noting that precision-guided missiles pose a profound challenge for missile defense systems. Arabs see US as complicit in Israel's Gaza war. Former Jordan envoy Washer. Yahoo! Arabs see the United States as complicit in Israel's war on Gaza for refusing to enforce a ceasefire until Hamas is crushed, an outcome that is far off and may not be possible, Jordan's former foreign minister said. Wednesday briefing. New York Times. Arab countries including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt are increasing their pleas to the U.S. to pressure Israel for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The countries argue that the failure to do so risks sabotaging the security of the entire Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected calls for a temporary ceasefire, insisting that the military campaign must destroy Hamas. Arab officials and scholars argue that this goal is not only impossible but counterproductive, as it would likely generate even more violence. Arab officials will gather in Riyadh this weekend for a summit where the conflict will be a top priority for discussion. Meanwhile, dire conditions continue for civilians in Gaza. The Israeli military has stated that it has reached the heart of Gaza City. The White House has said that a reoccupation of Gaza by Israel would not be the right thing to do. UN chief says Gaza deaths show something wrong with Israel operation. Reuters. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has criticized Israel's military operations against Hamas Palestinian militants in the Gaza Strip, saying that the number of civilians killed indicates that something is clearly wrong with Israel's approach. Guterres also called on Israel to understand that its actions are damaging its global public image and that it is against Israel's own interests to allow the humanitarian crisis in Gaza to continue. He highlighted the high number of children being killed in Gaza and said that military operations need to be conducted differently. Israeli troops fight in the heart of Gaza City amid global calls for pause. Washington Post. Israeli troops have entered the heart of Gaza City, reaching the Ansar roundabout, just a block away from the city's main port. As international calls for humanitarian pauses mount, the Israeli advance has raised concerns for the safety of civilians. Although Israel has urged residents to leave Gaza City, a lack of safe passage, fear, distrust and airstrikes in areas deemed safe have resulted in many choosing to stay. The ongoing conflict has caused the deaths of over 10,000 Palestinians, and the abduction of 240. The G7 countries have issued a joint statement condemning Hamas and supporting Israel's right to self-defense. Thousands of civilians flee North Gaza as Israeli troops and Hamas fighters battle. Reuters. Thousands of Palestinian civilians have been fleeing the north of Gaza in an attempt to escape the Israeli airstrikes and ground fighting between Israeli troops and Hamas militants. Israel has announced a 4-hour window of opportunity for residents to evacuate the north or risk being trapped in the violence. However, the central and southern parts of Gaza are also under fire. Palestinian health officials have reported that an airstrike in the Nuseirat refugee camp killed 18 people and in Khan Yunis, 6 people were killed. The Israeli military said that it has destroyed around 130 tunnel shafts in its effort to destroy the Hamas tunnel network. The military also reported that an airstrike killed a Hamas weapons maker and several fighters. The war between Israel and Gaza has now entered its second month, with both sides refusing to agree to a ceasefire. The United Nations and G7 nations have called for a humanitarian pause in the hostilities, due to the level of death and suffering in Gaza. The war has now become the bloodiest episode in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. We have the order to bomb. You have 2 hours. BBC. A dentist in Gaza has described how he received a phone call from an Israeli intelligence officer warning him that his neighborhood was about to be bombed. Mahmoud Shaheen was told to evacuate his third-floor flat and to ensure that everyone else did the same. He led a mass evacuation of his neighbors, pleading with them to run away. Over the course of the day, the Israeli military bombed 3 towers in the area, leaving hundreds of people homeless. Shaheen's account of the phone call provides a rare insight into the Israeli military's warnings to civilians ahead of bombings. Israel claims that it bombs military targets and complies with international law. During the current conflict, the Israeli military has phoned Gazans ahead of airstrikes to warn them. Shaheen's account has been verified by the BBC, which has spoken to other residents of Al-Zahra who also received evacuation warnings. However, the BBC has not been able to independently verify the contents of the phone call with Shaheen, and the Israeli military has not commented on the specific case. The Israeli military has called on Palestinians to evacuate their homes in certain areas before bombing. In some cases, civilians say they have not been warned ahead of time. Israel has killed over 10,000 people in Gaza since the start of the war, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. More than a third of those killed were children. The myth of the national security sweater, or why Israel is not the string that will unravel U.S. hegemony for good. Hill. The Israel-Hamas conflict has prompted discussions about U.S. national security interests. Some argue that events in certain regions, such as the Middle East, indicate declining U.S. power and the need to reassert global hegemony. However, this narrative ignores history and exaggerates the threats faced by the U.S. Unipolarity is rare in the history of nation-states, and the rise of China, the reassertion of Russian power, and the proliferation of political Islam are returning to historical norms. The U.S. should focus on its core national interests and avoid overextending itself on issues that are not relevant to those interests. Well, folks, it seems like the conflict between Israel and Hamas continues to escalate, with no end in sight. Hamas leaders are openly expressing their desire for sustained conflict and the destruction of Israel, while Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is refusing calls for a temporary ceasefire and insists on destroying Hamas. The situation is further complicated by the involvement of other Arab countries and the growing threat of missile technology in the region. The roots of this conflict go back centuries, with complex political, religious, and territorial issues at play. From Napoleon's proposal for a Jewish homeland in Palestine to the British Balfour Declaration and the UN partition plan, the conflict has seen numerous attempts at resolution, but with limited success. Now, the recent escalation of violence was sparked by protests and clashes in Jerusalem over the eviction of Palestinian families and Israeli security forces' response to worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This quickly escalated into a full-blown exchange of rocket fire between Israel and Hamas, resulting in a high number of casualties and widespread destruction. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has criticized Israel's military operations and called for a different approach. He highlights the high number of civilian deaths, particularly children, and urges Israel to understand the damage it's doing to its global public image and its own interests. However, Israeli troops continue to advance into Gaza City, raising concerns for the safety of civilians. The situation is dire for civilians in Gaza, with thousands fleeing their homes to escape the violence. The Israeli military has warned civilians ahead of airstrikes, but the scale of destruction and displacement is still staggering. It's a heartbreaking and complex situation, and there are no easy solutions in sight. Now, let's turn to you, my dear audience. What are your thoughts on this ongoing conflict? Do you see any potential avenues for a resolution? Let's discuss and see if we can shed some light on this dark and complicated situation. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.